Welcome to the Real Estate Explainer podcast, where we talk about anything and everything real estate. I'm your host, Brian Kiczula. Take notes. Today, Trevor Oldham is going to be talking about using podcasts to grow your personal brand. Let's jump right into the episode. Hey, Trevor, thanks for jumping on the podcast today. I'm excited to have you here. Certainly, podcasting is something that I'm using to grow my personal brand, as well as promote clients that I work with and really expose their individual niches. So the first thing that I really wanted to ask you is, how did you come up with the idea of podcasting you, and just how did it all kind of materialize and take shape?
Yeah, most certainly. And Brian, first off, I want to say thank you so much for having me today. And diving into my story, it was really back in 2015. I was running a different company at that time. It wasn't Podcasting You, but I thought it'd be cool to go out there and to start my own podcast. And back in 2015, podcasts are definitely weren't as popular as they are today. It's almost like back in 2015, it was like weird if you had a podcast, where today it's much more common for individuals to have a podcast. With that said, I was bootstrapping everything. I was the one booking the guests. I was the one editing the podcast. I was doing the show notes, basically everything that goes into a podcast. Fast forward 2 years from that, and I had all these skills, but I wasn't really making any money from the company, from the podcast. And honestly, I just started freelancing out. I joined a platform called Upwork and just really started to find clients through that platform. And eventually I found enough clients that wanted to get booked on podcasts. And I liked that aspect of it more than editing a podcast. And really the biggest aspect is it might take me an hour sitting down to edit a podcast, and I charge, say, $50 an hour. Where I could charge someone $50 to get them booked on a podcast, and it could take me 10 minutes to get them booked on a podcast. So just the time value made more sense to get people booked on podcasts, and just kept finding more clients through the freelance clients. I think it was about a year in before I hired that first employee. And then I think it was like 3 or 4 years in, honestly, before we even had a website. And then, that's really how it started. I never really expected it to grow as much as it has. Never expected to have a team or even start a PR company on my own. It just really blossomed over the last 7 years or so since we started. And especially since the pandemic, a lot more people were pushed towards podcasts and virtual events, where it really just took off since then. And that's obviously there's 7 years worth in there, but in a nutshell, that's
packed in there. Yeah.
Yeah,
so one of the things that I really like about podcasting you is, we were talking about it before I hit the record button, is as a cost segregation professional, for me to get on and do a podcast and week after week talk about cost segregation specifically, you can only hear about land improvement so many times before your eyes totally glaze over. Coming up with a good topic for a podcast is super important. The other thing is, podcasting can be a giant pain. Rewind, because full disclosure, I was actually a client of yours, even though you didn't know it, just over the last couple of years. And instead of doing a podcast on cost segregation, what we did is we went out and we were seeking out to be guests on different people's podcasts, specifically so that we could grow our brand. And it's really, what would I call it? Like protecting your brand as well. Mm-hmm. Because the more data that you have out there, the more instances that you are on the internet seen in a positive light, the more exposed you are to just the influences out there.
Yeah, exactly. The more that you put yourself out there, it's almost like the more credibility that you have. And it's funny, people hear you on a podcast and they're like, oh, this person must know what they're talking about, even though sometimes that might not be the case. But I think it does definitely give you that additional credibility just coming to you.
Yeah. And then also it's connecting with let's say the owners or the producers of other podcasts, mm-hmm. their guest or not their guest, but their listeners. You may hop on a podcast that has thousands and thousands of downloads every week. So now you're having conversations with not just the folks that are booked on your calendar, but literally the thousands of people that are downloading the podcast that you're a guest on.
Yeah, and that's one of the best aspects of it, where, and I know, Brian, you mentioned you recently started the podcast. I started my own podcast, and it's slow going. It definitely takes a long time to do it. I know from my previous experience, it could take really 6 months, 12 months, a year longer, 2 years to really, honestly, hopefully you start to see results month over month, but to start to see like a big impact on your business, it could be a decent amount of time where I get to go on a podcast such as yours, Brian, and other podcasts that are out there, and I get to leverage the audience that you've already built, where I don't have to build that audience, and maybe they haven't heard of me before. So you get that benefit of it, of coming to that audience that's already built, where you're not the one building that from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just having or being a guest on podcasts can really help grow your brand. Now, specifically in the real estate market or the real estate niche, one of the things that I encourage clients to do is talk about their specific locations. So I just had Matt Penzon talking about Eaton, Pennsylvania a few weeks ago. And it's really for these guys, these real estate investors that are out there wholesaling or they're building portfolios of property, they can expose their local niche market that maybe an investor in, let's say, California, they would never think of that market. But then all of a sudden we start talking about the real benefits to investing in that specific market. You may be able to pull in, I don't know, even if you do one additional transaction, you're just reaching people that you otherwise would have never spoken to.
Exactly. And you could think of, if you're like a multifamily investor, that's pretty broad, because think of everywhere where you could buy multifamily apartments, obviously across the entire US. So maybe you're a multifamily individual and your specialty is, I don't know, let's say Austin, Texas or Dallas, Texas. Hopefully not Austin. It's not doing too good. Let's say Dallas, Texas as an example. And then I was talking to an individual where he was doing like a tertiary market outside of Cincinnati. I think it was like he was a radius within 40 miles within the city outside of it. And he's an expert in that. And that's where he buys his apartments. And I think you really get that exposure, whether you're listening to the shows or whether you're a guest on the shows, because even if you are a multifamily investor, you have that different experience in one market than someone's going to have in a different market, unless, say, you're national and you're maybe a BlackRock or something and you buy all over the country. But a lot of these, especially our clients and operators out there going on podcasts, they're smaller teams, maybe 10 to 20 individuals, and they're focused on that specific market where you could become known in that specific market for being that sort of go-to person. Where I was like, oh, I want to go out there and invest in Phoenix, Arizona. Oh, this guy, he exclusively invests in Phoenix, Arizona. Okay, I should go work with him because I heard him on this podcast, and so on.
If, let's say, one of our listeners is interested in they're looking to be a guest on different podcasts, how can podcasting you help?
Yeah, most certainly. So our preface is to say we work exclusively with folks in the real estate space. Obviously, that's abroad. I quickly learned that I wanted to niche down from just pretty much I would work with any niche early on, to the last 5 years or so niching down. And then obviously learning within the real estate space, there's a ton of niches. We can go from everywhere from your multifamily mobile home park, self-storage, all the way to people like yourself, Brian, your cost seg specialists, and you have your attorneys, CPAs, different things like that. And really what we do with our clients is we work with them to go out there and get them booked on podcasts, really trying to hone in on their target audience, learning who are they looking to talk to? Are they looking to talk to general real estate investors? Is there a specific niche in real estate? Or is it someone raising capital where you're going after more of your high net worth investors? And then really just based on that, we'll put together a game plan and try our best. Usually we're pretty good. We don't have to refund clients too often, which is always a good thing, and go out there and get them booked on podcasts.
That's absolutely right. It's making sure that you're speaking to the niche or the audience that you're looking at. I was talking to you about hiring VAs in the Philippines or not the Philippines, but VAs in general to help out booking podcasts or becoming a guest on the podcast. And what you don't want to have happen is you don't want to set up your podcast and get on and talk to someone who has a cooking channel.
Yeah, exactly. And that'd be like for me going on, talk to someone that does fix and flips, or it just, unless like they have a coaching product or service, it just doesn't make sense. And there's going to be like no way for me to help you out. I can't bring you in lead flow from that, getting you booked on podcasts other than you sharing your story. So you definitely want to make sure you're going out there on the right podcasts and not ones that, you're going to be wasting your time on, because it doesn't make sense for what you're going to be talking about.
Now, when someone is looking at becoming a guest on a podcast, what advice would you give them for preparing for the podcast and then just being present or being on the podcast? What advice can you give us?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, or I guess backtracking it, and I found what helped me to become more comfortable being a guest on podcasts was attending Toastmasters. Just did that for a little while. And for those listening that it's like, what's Toastmasters? It's basically a public speaking, I don't know if it's a class. I don't know if I would say it a class, but you meet up with individuals about once a week, once every other week, even once a month, depending on what your preference is. And you just practice your public speaking skills. I found that allowed me to be more comfortable as a podcast guest. And it's funny because I run a podcast booking agency and we're working with our clients all the time to get them booked on podcasts. But I myself wasn't 100% comfortable doing that. So I found that just by joining Toastmasters and going through that route, that that definitely helped me. So if you are like, I'm a little nervous about it, not sure what to expect, I found that just again, joining that Toastmasters was very beneficial. Outside of that, you just want to make sure you have a good quality podcast microphone. Sometimes you might have headphones, but you might have a webcam, you might have a ring light, but at the end of it, you just want to have a really good quality podcast microphone before you even hop onto the podcast interviews. I use a Blue Yeti microphone. You can use a Blue Snowball if you're on a budget. I looked it up on Amazon yesterday, just out of curiosity. It was $50. I think I bought one 7 years ago, $50. So they haven't gone up in price that much. I just want to make sure, again, you have a good quality podcast microphone. And then from there, it's figuring out like, who's our target audience? Who am I looking to speak to? And I know we discussed it briefly, but are you looking to talk to general real estate investors? Are you looking to talk to more your folks that are going to invest with you on the raising capital side of the business? And then from there, it's really going out and building a list of podcasts that you think that you'd want to be a guest on. If you're newer and you've never been on a podcast, it probably makes sense for you to go on podcasts that are a little bit newer themselves. So maybe podcasts that have 5-10 episodes, maybe they've been around for a month or two. One, it's going to be easier for yourself to get booked on those podcasts. And then two, they're not too big yet, where if you make a mistake on the podcast, you just pause, just things don't go right on the show. That way you have that back, you're not going to ruin that chance of an opportunity. And I think back to myself, when I was starting to go out and go on podcasts and talk about the benefits of investing for real estate investors to go on podcasts, I had gone on a bigger show and I felt like I just blew my opportunity on it. It was like our exact criteria, exactly who we wanted to go on to. I just didn't have that story down. And I'm like, I wish I would have practiced in a way on 5 to 10 shows. But that's really the best way that I would go about it, is when you're going on these shows, is just practicing your stories, talking about your A to B story. Like I know early on, Brian, we were talking about how I started my company and I went from point A to point B, started in 2015, no podcasting experience. 2017, I have the company. And then now 2024, we've grown it to what it is today. So people really like stories. So it's sharing those different stories on the podcast. And then, yeah, I think it's just being consistent. That's the biggest thing I find for me. I want to at least try to go be a guest on a podcast once a week, maybe at most once every 2 weeks. I find that just helps me refine my story, helps me get better as a podcast guest, where if I do one this week and then one 2 months from now, it's just going to be a little bit harder. Maybe I fall back into not being comfortable. So it's, again, having that consistency there as well. But yeah, I think that's really what I'd recommend for someone to be a guest if they're going out there. And then two, you have to obviously put together a nice pitch that you're going to send out to the podcast host. And that's just including value to the podcast host of why they should have you as a guest on their show. And then maybe putting together a professional one sheet, which could be considered like a media kit that you also send the podcast host.
I've actually got yours right in front of me, and they're definitely helpful when you're looking at having a guest come on a podcast, is you have their image, you've got their contact information, their basic backgrounds, who you're talking to before you get on the podcast. So I think that having that message in place before you're a guest is absolutely key. That way, you said it, is be prepared. If you're going to talk about your specific market, know your market, talk about the market. Or if you're, let's say, doing novations or you're doing wholesaling, have a good list of items that you're going to talk about, your 7 tips that you would recommend in the market. One of the things that I often talk to guests about is, how do you underwrite your individual deals? And that's something that I found that's universal with all real estate investors, is they're all underwriting individual deals. So it's a good talking point. And it's just so much information because I'm able to pull that out of them. Something you just said, like maybe a client's got a coaching class or something like that. Basically, they're giving us mini master classes in their specific niche, if you can pull that out of them. So as a guest, if you can have your story laid out, I just think that's super key. You did talk about the equipment that you need if you're going to be a guest on a podcast. And what I would say is, like you just said about you're blowing your opportunity with the larger podcast, clearly you didn't blow that opportunity. It was an opportunity that you did. Maybe it wasn't the best, but who cares? You move forward. But you do need to have your equipment. What you don't want to do is record a podcast from a car or from a parking lot. You just don't want to do that because it's not going to come across clearly. Your audio is it's just not going to work. When it comes to the video is a whole different thing. The challenge with video is you do need lighting, you need backgrounds. You don't want to invite everybody into your kitchen or your bedroom or your hotel room, whatever it is. So just make sure you've got a good place to record. So that's what I'd say when it comes to equipment. Also, though, going back to the editing pieces, the podcasts aren't live. So if you're coming on as a guest, you're not going on live radio. I've done AM radio shows before where they're live radios or a live show. It goes out once and it's done. You can edit these down. So if there's an error that comes out when you're doing a podcast, or if you're a guest on a show, just know that you can cut it out in most cases.
Yeah, and that's the nice aspect of it, where if you do mess something up, you can go back and, and you can go over it again. But I was thinking of a time where when I was hosting my own podcast, I was interviewing, I can't remember the person now. It's been quite a long time, but they were ordering fast food. I was trying to interview them on the podcast. So you can imagine that they were going through the drive-thru, and you would ask them a question, they would talk to me and then stop for a second. And I was like, I can't use this podcast interview. And that's the end of it. But yeah, like you mentioned, just getting like a nice quiet spot in your house and just make sure you have you're free of distractions and there's not going to be a lot of noise. And I find that too, like occasionally they'll have like construction on our road. I just reschedule the podcast interview because the mics are pretty good. They could pick up a lot of the background noise. If you think something's coming up like that, or you have family visiting, just reschedule the interview. It's always going to be better in the long run.
Unfortunately, though, when you reschedule, this is a reality. A lot of times you get bumped out for weeks or months. So just know that the host isn't blowing you off, or maybe you're not blowing the host off. It's just a matter of schedules. A lot of folks don't just record podcasts Monday through Friday. They usually go to a studio, or they set up specifically because they know that their kids aren't home, or they're in an office and nobody else is in the office that day. So they'll have just the quiet space they need. So we went over the equipment that you need, the type of podcast to look out for. Can you talk about some of the real benefits associated with being a guest on a podcast?
Yeah, most certainly. So I would say one of the best aspects I found that I didn't really expect it going in, but it's just that networking aspect where, Brian, you and I, we get to talk today, say we're talking 20, 30 minutes, or really being able to have a nice conversation and learn a lot about each other's background, learn about what each other does. And I find that's a really nice networking aspect of being a guest. Sometimes I'll talk to a host and they refer clients to our business. Sometimes I can refer clients to their business depending on what they do. So there's that nice aspect of it. Outside of that, I know we discussed it before, but just the benefit of you being able to go on someone's podcast and they already have that pre-established audience out there, which is nice. So if you go on a podcast, they already have that built audience. They get to learn about you. And then when they get to learn about you, you get the benefit where they could come back to your website and maybe they schedule a discovery call with your company. Maybe they download your ebook or your opt-in, whatever that may be. So that's obviously the quantifiable. That's pretty much why everyone would want to go on a podcast, is they want more clients, they want more leads, depending on what you do. That's obviously the biggest benefit. Outside of that, you get a nice SEO aspect of it, where a lot of the times you'll go on a podcast. Once the episode goes live, that podcast host, they'll put up a show notes page, which can basically be a recap of the episode, and they're going to link back to your website, and that would be considered a backlink. The more backlinks you get, the better Google's going to look at your website. The better Google looks at your website, the higher you're going to rank. And obviously, the higher you rank, hopefully you get more leads out of that. Not to get too technical, but just a good thing all around to get is more backlinks equals Google being more happy. So that's always a good thing. And then I think just building up that brand awareness, going out there, building up that credibility, where like on our website, we have a media section where you go on and you can see all the podcast interviews I've done. So if anyone is interested, does this guy actually know what he's talking about other than his about page? You can all see it on that media section on our website. And then really, I find the last aspect of it is being able to take the podcast interview and create different snippets out there for social media. So maybe from a 20-25 minute interview, I'll go out there and take 5 to 7 social media clips from it and put them out there. I find LinkedIn typically works best for us and generating leads. So putting out there on LinkedIn, and we'll put them out there on YouTube and in different places like that. But it is nice having that content where it's hard sometimes to sit down and write different content, where just doing an interview, a lot of the times it's just easy to pull content out of that. And I find that more and more people doing that, not everyone, but just taking that video content from the interview. So there's really numerous benefits of going out there and being a guest on podcasts. you get to practice your speaking skills. Obviously, that helps. I found, not that I do it now, but back in the day, I was taking all the sales calls for our company. I found that by going on podcasts, it allowed me to speak the lingo better, allowed me to get better to understand who my clients are, what they're talking about, where it got to a point where now I invest in real estate, but I hadn't done it before 2022, where someone would be like, oh, like you sound like you really know what you're talking about, which is obviously what you want on a sales call for someone that doesn't invest in real estate, but you're talking to real estate investors all the time. So I found that was an added benefit. Again, that you can't really quantify that, but it just came where I was just better to talk to my prospect from just going out there on these podcasts and practicing my story.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. If you back up and really look at it, brand management, I think you covered that. I know you covered it. So you're pushing your brand out there. You're going to be exposed on the internet, on different people's sites. Always have the backlink back to your website. So you're growing your backlinks, which is super important. You covered that. The social media aspect, I think, is so key. Getting on there and being able to take, and I think you're not saying, hey, I'm editing down my own podcast. What you're doing is you're taking the audio or the video or both from the podcast that you're on and coming up with the talking points that you want to promote on your own social media. And LinkedIn, I think, is a great place. That's where I'm not on Facebook. I have a Facebook account, but that's not really where I want to be. LinkedIn is a great place for me because it's something that I can promote if I'm out at a site inspection or if I'm talking to someone about a specific real estate topic that I think a lot of people should know about. I can do the same thing. I can take that clip and I can put it onto LinkedIn. And I think repurposing the content is just super important. I'd like to thank today's sponsor, CostSeg RX, a cost segregation company. If you're interested in a cost segregation study, log on to realestateexplainer.com and click the cost segregation link at the top of the page. Now, one of the things I also want to ask is what shouldn't people do besides get on a podcast and order food from a fast food restaurant? What else shouldn't they do?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a big one. That one always just cracks me up thinking back on it. But yeah, outside of that, I would say you're going on the podcast and there's always a time and place for the podcast host will typically ask you at the end of the interview, where can the audience learn more about you? If they want to get in touch with you, where should they go? That's the opportunity where you can go on and you can really plug yourself and you can plug your company, unless the host brings it up during the interview within itself. But I find, and even myself being a host now, going back into that role, occasionally I'll have a guest and all I feel like they're doing is just like self-promoting, like very hard, like really pushing it down my audience, really being almost like being like an infomercial used car salesman type of individual, where if you're going on a podcast, you really just want to go out there and provide helpful content. And there'll always be a time and place where you can promote your product or service. I've never had that. I think maybe one podcast I've ever gone on where the host hasn't asked me, like, where can our audience learn more about you, or something similar to that. So I find that's the biggest thing that I see is people are going on these podcasts and they're just self-promoting. Hey, you want to get access to my book? Go here. Okay, you want to get access to our next deal? Go here. And like we're like 3 or 4 minutes into the interview and you're just really promoting yourself too hard, where for me, that just turns me off when I'm listening to a podcast interview when the person's overly self-promotional. But I find that's the biggest aspect that I find. Maybe the second one I'd throw in there would be not being conversational to a degree. Obviously, sometimes you don't have to go in full depth and explain something, but I think back to an individual I had on my podcast about, I don't know, a little while ago. I'm not going to give any names, but you ask him a question like, what does the self-storage forecast look like in the future? Oh, I think it looks pretty good. Why does it look pretty good? Just because I think that it's going to be. So you got to give me something to work with here.
It can go both ways, though. I've also had guys that'll go on.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a 30-minute tangent, so it's got to be something in the middle.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. So I find, even for myself, I'm like, I'm going to be out of breath if I talk more than 5 minutes. I find if I'm explaining something, like maybe 5 minutes, depending on what I'm talking about, but usually 2 to 3 minutes, and then give the chance for the host to rebuttal. That's definitely the sweet spot. So like you mentioned before, really going on too long and taking 10 minutes. There's been times where I'm thinking of this particular individual that was like overly promotional, where in like a 45-minute interview, I think I got 2 questions in there. One was like, how did you start your company? And then maybe 30 minutes into it. And I'm like, I didn't really get to ask that many questions that were going to be beneficial for our audience, because you hijacked the medium and But yeah, like you mentioned, it's definitely, you don't want to be too long. You don't want to be too short. You want to be somewhere in the middle. And then you don't want to be overly promotional as well.
And I think that's part of going back to what you said earlier. It's being prepared as to what you're going to say. And when a guest, or not a guest, but a host asks, how would you like to be contacted? Really give the preferred method for them to contact you. If you don't want people to call you, don't give them your telephone number. If you prefer clients to email you, absolutely give them your email. If you want them just to go to your website, give them the website address. Another thing that I found it's very helpful is using lead magnets or using a giveaway. Go to this site and download my book. Do you recommend the promotional items?
Yeah, most certainly. So that's nice as well. Like, so if you go on our website, you'll see like access to like our ebook there. And I find that people would rather do that, honestly, a lot of the times than going and booking a discovery call with our company, because the difference between someone going on our website and downloading our ebook is a lot less invasive than booking a call with our company where you have to talk to someone. Just given human nature, people would rather download the ebook. They get to know you over time. Like, Brian, let's say you had an ebook like the 9 best ways to use cost seg on your next real estate investment, just something similar like that. And then they go through, they read it. Okay, Brian's an expert in this. This makes sense for what I'm doing in real estate. I'm going to go ahead and book a call with them. So it's definitely important having that lead magnet set up. And honestly, what I did for our company and what I found was helpful for us, because I was like, what type of lead magnet am I going to put together? And I used our Google Analytics, and I saw like the 10 most trafficked articles on our website. And I took those 10 articles and I hired someone on Upwork for a few $100. I said, hey, put together a nice looking ebook on this. And then that's what they did. And then it's very professional. I know that this is what people are looking for, just because I could see that they went to it on our website. So like an article might be the benefits of being a podcast guest, how to share your podcast interview across social media, how to create a good lead magnet. Yeah, there's different things like that, and throwing that in our lead magnet. So it doesn't have to be overly complicated for you to go out there and create something. And it doesn't have to be overly expensive as well for you to go out there and create a high quality lead magnet. And the way I heard about it one time was like, the way that you have your lead magnet is you want it to be just as nice as if someone was paying for it. So you don't want it to just be bare bones and basic. You just want to make sure that it looks nice, so someone is actually seeing that they got the value out of it, and that they're not just downloading it and it looks like it took 20 minutes for you to put it together.
When the lead magnet, I think a lot of clients, they will write books. I like the idea of having a smaller pamphlet. It's something that you could actually accomplish. You could finish it. And if you're talking about, let's say, a specific niche, let's talk about my niche, or not my niche, but where I live, Sarasota, Florida. And I wanted to talk about all the benefits of Sarasota, Florida, or the market conditions for storage facilities, or the market conditions for restaurants. You could certainly put that together and it would be valuable. So I think that's it. It's just adding value with whatever lead magnet you're putting together. I wanted to ask was regarding pricing. How do you price out your product?
Yeah, most certainly. So it's definitely evolved over the years. And the way that we do it now is we'll have basically 3 different packages. So the first interview package is 4 podcast interviews per month we book for our clients. That runs about $1,400 a month. We have a 6th interview package that runs about $1,800 a month. And then we have a 50 interview package, and we just put new pricing on that. So I believe it's like $12,250 or $12,500. It's bad that I don't know the exact price, but I know we just updated it. But that one we typically will spread out 4 payments over the course of the year for the clients. And we find that works best for our clients where they're getting booked on a podcast a week to about 2 podcasts a week, or maybe 2 podcasts, or maybe 3 podcasts every 2 weeks, something along those lines. That's typically what we find works best with our clients.
Now, have you found where clients they can't do all the podcasts? They're booking 4 for the month. They're going on vacation. They're tied up in meetings. They're doing site inspections, whatever it is. What happens to those 4 credits, if you will? Do they go away, or do you get to stack those up?
Yeah, we can definitely stack them. So the way that we structure it is we're just like I say month to month, but we don't have any contracts or anything like that with our clients unless the client asks. Then we have stuff we can put together and send over to them. So we give them that flexibility where if they are going off, where for a month, like a lot of the times we'll get clients. I know we're coming up on the summer months now where they're just going to pause their package just because their kids are off. They're taking more vacations. They don't have as much time, or we do stack it like you mentioned. Hey, I can only do 2 interviews this month. Okay, we'll book you on 6 next month, or if you're like, I just 4 is too much for me, and then we'll offer them a 2-show package. We'll drum it down. Sometimes the clients will go on a 1-show package a month because they're so busy. We don't typically, I won't offer it up front. I'll usually do the 4 and 6, and then if they say, hey, can I do less, then that's when we'll offer those additional packages for them.
I think that's great to be super flexible. Just, I know in my day-to-day world, trying to do a podcast every week or to do a podcast every other week as the host can certainly stack up. And then as a guest, because we all are busy. So having that flexibility so that you can book the 4 per month, but then hit pause if you need to, or if you're saying, hey, I can do a lot more of these, just increase it up. One of the things that I've noticed with being a host and certainly guest as well is the scheduling aspect. How have you been able to overcome the scheduling conflicts that come in between guest and host? How do you handle that? Do you do that, or do you rely on the host to do that?
Yeah, so a lot of the times it's just looking between the 2 calendars for our clients. So either the client will have a Calendly and we'll book on that and we'll take a look at the host's Calendly, or our client will give us access to the calendar. And yeah, a lot of the times just going back and forth with the podcast host trying to figure out a time. And I find that a good majority of the time the host will be accommodating. Let's say you only record Tuesdays at 2 p.m. and our client has a standing meeting with the client Thursdays at 2 p.m. So it's neither one can budge because it just doesn't work out. So in that scenario, sometimes we'll just work with the host and try to just figure out a different time where we can reschedule. Maybe we book out far enough in the future where the client can reschedule a meeting that they have. And sometimes it just doesn't work out in the end, which is unfortunate. But, we try to prevent that if we can, where there's just so much going back and forth where maybe someone's in a different time zone. Maybe they're doing interviews on a time that just doesn't work for you. Like, I've come across like a podcast where they only do interviews like Saturday, 1 p.m. I just don't want to be tied down to that. Just personally, like with my daughter being home and my wife, I don't want to be tied down, like knowing like I have to be home on Saturday at 1 p.m. So that'd be like, and since, hey, do you have any availability during the week? No, I don't. Like, okay, maybe that's not going to work out. And again, that's more few and far between that I find that happens. I find that more often than not, you tell the host, hey, your times don't work for me. This is what my availability looks like. Does anything work for you? And a lot of the times people will be accommodating. I don't find it to be that much of an issue. Again, maybe from time to time, but for the most part, I find hosts to be pretty accommodating with it.
Before we wrap up the podcast, I'd certainly like to ask, if people want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, most certainly. So interested in booking a call with our company, they can just go to our website, podcastingyou.com. That's podcastingyou.com. Or if they want to get in touch with me personally, probably the best way would just be to connect and message me on LinkedIn. And that should be pretty easy to find. It's just going to be my name, Trevor Oldham, and happy to connect there as well.
Thank you for being on the podcast today. I'll talk to you soon. If you'd like to get connected with today's guest, log on to realestateexplainer.com and click the Get Connected button on the homepage.